Okay, what if I told you that a single sentence from the Bible could lay out a complete blueprint for a husband's role in marriage? It sounds kind of wild, right? But that's the whole idea behind a sermon we're breaking down today. We're going to see how one verse gets unpacked into a framework of 4 key duties for a husband. So let's jump right in and see what they are.
So, here's the game plan. First, we're going to look at the foundational verse itself. Then, we'll break down each of the 4 duties one by one. What it means to lead with knowledge, how to understand that really controversial phrase, weaker vessel, what it looks like to see a wife as a fellow heir, and finally, what happens spiritually when a husband, doesn't follow through on all this.
All right, so the whole framework we're about to explore, it's all built from a really close reading of just one specific passage. The speaker treats it almost like an architectural blueprint, where every single phrase is its own distinct instruction.
And here it is. This is the verse that everything else is built on. Likewise, husbands, live with your wives in an understanding way, showing honor to the woman as the weaker vessel, since they are heirs with you of the grace of life, so that your prayers may not be hindered. So you can see how the speaker breaks this down, right? There's a primary command, 2 descriptions of how to do it, and then a final consequence if you don't. Let's start with that first command, live with your wives in an understanding way.
Okay, so duty number 1. It comes from that first part of the verse, live with your wives in an understanding way. Now, the source translates this as living according to knowledge. And this is key. It's not just about, being a good listener. It's interpreted as an active command for the husband to lead his family based on deep, actively acquired knowledge.
So, what kind of knowledge are we talking about here? Well, the speaker breaks it down into 3 big areas. First, you have to know her, your wife. Second, you have to know yourself. And third, you have to know the Word. And again, this isn't a passive thing. It's a call to literally study and have conversations. The husband is supposed to study his wife's thoughts and needs, really understand his own blind spots and flaws, and then use the Bible as the ultimate guide for his leadership.
And check this out. Here's a really powerful example of how a husband is supposed to get that knowledge. The speaker talks about a personal practice he called the state of the marriage date. Every single Monday, he'd ask his wife for direct feedback on his leadership, asking things like, anything in my life or our lives right now that you would like to see different so that you could flourish? And he's very clear. He frames this not as her leading, but as him gathering the intelligence he needs to lead well.
All right, now for the second duty. And this one comes from a phrase that, let's be honest, can be really jarring to our modern ears. Honoring the woman as the weaker vessel. So let's take a closer look at the speaker's very specific interpretation of what this phrase is supposed to mean, and, just as importantly, what it's not supposed to mean.
So what's really interesting is how narrowly this term gets defined. According to the source, weaker vessel has absolutely nothing to do with faith or intellect or character. In fact, he says the wife could be way stronger spiritually. The argument is that it refers strictly to a general, average difference in physical strength. And he uses the analogy of why we have separate leagues for men and women in most professional sports to make his point.
So the bottom line is this. If weaker vessel just means a physical difference, then showing honor in this context means protection. The speaker basically reframes this entire duty as the husband's core responsibility to be the protector for his wife and his family.
And he uses this really vivid story to drive the point home. He says, imagine a man walking with his girlfriend, and she happens to have a black belt in karate. If a guy with a knife suddenly threatens them, he argues it doesn't matter that she's probably more competent in a fight. The man's role is to step in front, get her behind him, and essentially say, over my dead body. That, in his view, is what honoring the weaker vessel looks like in practice.
Okay, let's move on to the third duty. This one also revolves around the idea of honor, but now we're shifting from the physical to the spiritual. It's all based on that next part of the verse, the idea that wives are heirs with you of the grace of life. And this is huge because it establishes a profound spiritual equality between them.
And the speaker defines fellow heir with this incredibly powerful image. He says, she's going to be a queen of the universe someday. You sleep with a queen, you sleep with an heiress of the world. So the argument is, a husband has to see his wife not just as his partner, but as a literal heiress to God's kingdom. And this isn't just some abstract theological idea, it's meant to totally transform how a husband treats his wife, day in and day out.
So what does it actually look like in real life? Well, according to the source, if a husband truly sees his wife as a future queen, it's just going to naturally lead to things like kindness, respect, tenderness, a genuine willingness to listen, and even a sense of marveling at the person he gets to share his life with. Okay, so we've got the duties, but what are the consequences for, well,
for failing at them. The very last part of the verse lays out the stakes pretty clearly, so that your prayers may not be hindered. Whoa, that creates a really direct link between the health of your marriage and the effectiveness of your spiritual life.
But what does that actually mean, for your prayers to be hindered? It's a pretty intense phrase, and the speaker is upfront about it. He admits he isn't 100% certain, but he does offer 3 distinct possibilities for how a troubled marriage can basically block your prayers.
Okay, so here are the 3 potential meanings he lays out. Number 1, a lack of spiritual harmony could just break the power of praying together. Number 2, a husband's own sin in the relationship could create a guilty conscience that makes it really hard to pray authentically. And number 3, which is maybe the most obvious, is that the interpersonal tension just makes it practically impossible to even pray together freely. And he shares a deeply personal story to illustrate this. He talks about times in his own marriage when the tension was so thick they could barely even speak to each other. But even then, he says, as the leader, he would still make them get down on their knees to pray. And sometimes the only word he could manage to say was help. He frames this not as being a hypocrite, but as an act of necessary leadership, especially in a moment of crisis.
So, there you have it, a whole framework for a husband's role in marriage, all built on these 2 main pillars, leading through knowledge and honoring through protection. But this leaves us with a pretty big question to think about, right? How does a leadership model like this, built on concepts of protection and knowledge, actually shape the power dynamics inside a modern partnership today?